And so a warm welcome to you, Bruce Pardy. And we're glad that you're going to be here today in this discussion live.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, David. It's great to be with you. I really looking forward to it.
Well, and Bruce, we had a terrific conversation. And it's quite interesting because you are not only a professor at Queen's in Law, but also a good friend of Frontier, but also you are the executive director of Rights Probe. And maybe we just want to pause before we dive into the whole topic of law, but what is Rights Probe? We would like to probe this topic here, Bruce.
Right. Thank you. Thank you for the question. Rights Probe is a think tank. It's a small think tank. I like to describe it as a law and liberty think tank. It's a division of the Energy Probe Research Foundation. And we focus on, if you like, the shifting legal ground beneath our feet. We try to explore the ways in which the law is changing, has changed in a way I think that would surprise a lot of Canadians, although a lot of Canadians can see it now.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that happened during COVID is that some of the things that were already the state of affairs in the law became much more apparent, transparent. And I think for some people, it's been a bit of a wake-up call. So we like to explore these issues to try and figure out, what the state of things is, what's wrong with it, where we went wrong, and so on.
So bravo on you. So check out Rights Probe. What are the coordinates on that, Bruce?
Yes, so we have a website where all the material is posted. It's rightsprobe.org. That's RIGHTSPROBE, one word, .org.
Excellent. So this is very important insights for every Canadian. They matter to our day-to-day lives. And we're going to go through some of those examples over the next hour. And we certainly welcome, again, the questions from the audience in terms of what you think, in terms of, use the phrase, the shifting ground of the law beneath our feet is so profound. And speaking of the law, we obviously had that discussion. We released that recording on Tuesday, and we had some delightful comments, a lot. And I just wanted to highlight a couple. One was one of the members of the audience views you, Bruce, as a national treasure, and we all know that. But it's just important that we mention that, and I mean that sincerely. It's amazing in Canada, we can't take these issues for granted, or the rule of law and all that goes with it. But you're one of the outspoken leaders in our country on that. So that is true. So I would agree with that comment and keep those comments coming. So that's very nice.
Well, thank you. That's very kind of them. Of course, I have a lot of company, and you're among them, David. And it's very important that we carry on with this. So thank you.
It really is. And it's not for the faint of heart. So thank you. The other comment that we got was from a person who said, the last 3 years have been difficult, referencing COVID-19. And to be able to have this discussion was so helpful to understand the perspective in terms of what's happening to our civil liberties and what the heck happened. And so he was very grateful for that discussion. So those are heartwarming comments, and show that people seem to be really recognizing the kind of points that you're making, Bruce. And just to recap, for those people that haven't listened to that recording, please make sure to subscribe to our social media channels. Go to the Frontier Center for Public Policy website. Look at the program with Professor Bruce Pardy. And on that note, if I had to sum up our discussion, and I'm going to attempt this, Bruce, is that you really powerfully laid out how we have two kind of visions of the law. You called one the so-called blueprint law, where, dare I say, a lot of busybodies seek to control every aspect of our life. Those are my words, not yours. And then secondly, there's the other traditional, dare I say, classical liberal view of law that respects the individual. It's not all about the state. In fact, it's about civil society and respecting and tolerating that we are different individual adults and we can choose to live our lives the way we live them. And that the law is more like a guardrail rather than a prescriptive little blueprint trying to unrealistically, manage every part of life. Now, obviously, I'm not being totally balanced per se in my perspective, but I think it's a profound difference. So, did I get a good grade on my summation, Bruce, on my
Yes,
summary?
David, I think that's fair. I think that's fair. So the blueprint model that you're speaking of is one in which government behaves as though they want to herd people into particular behaviors and particular thinking, and they have a design. It's a sort of a centrally planned design for the way things ought to be. And yes, that can be contrasted with the other way of thinking about this, which is people. The starting point should be that people own their own lives and they make their own decisions about how they want their lives to go. And yes,
Wow.
you need the law as a guardrail, exactly as you said, to be there when things go wrong, when things get violent or the like. So we're not talking anarchy here, but we're talking about a society in which you have sort of a basic legal framework that will allow people to direct their own destinies.
Wow.
And as time goes on, we are getting further and further away from that.
No, it's really quite profound. I think of, Bruce, when you say these two different visions, I was thinking about it a lot last night and really reflecting on this in so many conversations and experience over the years. And one of them I recall was with quite a conversation with a friend of mine, the Honorable Grant Devine, the former premier of the province of Saskatchewan. And he led quite a shift in public policy, but more than that, I would say a culture and really a profound fork in the road, if you will, for Saskatchewan. Saskatchewan, as you know, has this incredible history of being ground zero for the founding, really, of socialism in Canada.
Mhm.
And then it went forward. It was kind of, not really working very well as they sought to make everything under the authority of the state. Every enterprise. It was really remarkable. So he took a different path. But on reflection of that history, that has resulted in frankly, Saskatchewan being one of the most successful provinces, I think, in our federation, I would say.
Mhm.
And as I asked him about that history, I said, what would be the key takeaways? And he said a couple of them. One is culture and
Mhm.
the attitude of enabling the people to succeed, empowering them. So I thought that was a very profound point. But he said something else, that as the state gets so huge, you have to be very practical in what you can manage. And if it gets too large, you just simply cannot be realistically grounded in what you can manage. And I thought that was a really kind of a profound but simply stated difference that reflected our discussion
Mhm.
about these different paths of law, that the state gets so huge that basically it's the administrative state,
Mhm.
as you said in our discussion, Bruce, that is really controlling all our lives. And no politician is going to be able to manage that. Does that resonate with you?
Oh, no, that's true. So we have undergone, both in Canada, but more broadly in the West, what has been called a managerial revolution.
Indeed.
And it's happened over a long period of time,
Yeah.
decades and decades ago. Some people identify the New Deal after the
Hmm.
Depression as the time when it really started to ramp up, but other historians will point to other moments in time. But the fact of the matter is that this managerial revolution has produced this administrative state, and it is not just the case that there's a whole lot of government agencies doing everything, and there are, but also that there's this idea that
Hmm.
that the purpose of government is to solve social problems and guide us all through life.
Hmm.
And if you ask people on the street this question, I think an awful lot of them would agree with it, because after all, it's what they've grown up with. It's what they have
Yeah.
been led to believe that government is for. I mean, what else is it for? Might say.
Hmm.
And so this other model that we've been referring to, the one in which government is basically in the background unless something goes awry,
Hmm.
that model hasn't been the case for a long, long time. Now, the administrative state has grown over time. You might even say exponentially from its origins,
Hmm.
and to the point where it's sort of dominating basically everything in our society now. But people are used to it, and And the danger is that people who can see that things are not right and that things are not being managed properly
Mm-hmm.
will conclude that the problem is a bad policy, a policy that's
Yeah.
been put together badly, and that the solution is to go back and have the government make a different policy.
Yeah. Right.
Now, often they are bad policies, but this is all really beside the point. The point is the government shouldn't be managing us. And it's not just a case of bad policy. It's a question of having policy at all
Yeah.
on various kinds of questions.
Exactly. So the other thing that struck me about our conversation is there kind of these inevitable dynamics of this path towards the government controls everything. And I know there's been all kinds of things written about this, but specifically the law.
Mhm.
So when you said about how wokeism or cultural Marxism has embedded itself in so many institutions, basically saying, if everything is about the oppressed versus the oppressor, it's a profound ideology that justifies the state getting its fingers in everything, using the
Yes.
state to
Yes.
rebalance power. Everything's seen through these cynical, hate-filled views of anyways, I don't want to go down the whole discussion about ideology
It's quite
too
a
much,
rabbit
but
hole. To be
it's a
sure.
rabbit hole. But it is a very important driver, I would say, as you
Yes.
said,
Yes.
about building the state bigger. Because of the social injustice, we've got to intervene here, here, and here, and also over there, and they control everything. So it's an incredibly patronizing, destructive view, I think, of other people, that we think the worst of other people rather than the best of each other. Is it kind of like a profound, almost statement about psychology and how we view other people, or what do you think?
Well, yes, in part, but I mean, I think it's quite right. If you take these two examples, and there are more examples, of course, on the list, but these two examples, the wokeism and COVID.
Hmm.
I mean, you could frame it this way. Part of the explanation for why governments have gone have embraced these things so strongly
Hmm.
is because, as you alluded to, they justify management.
Hmm.
If
Exactly.
if you are trying to achieve social justice in the sense that you're trying to pursue writing an unlimited number of microaggressions
Hmm.
between the oppressed and the oppressors, that requires an unlimited degree of expertise, first of all, and attention and interference in the way people interact. That is a perfect justification for more and more management in personal relationships.
Wow.
And COVID, for its sake, um, requires, well, let's put it this way: COVID, in a sense, was the managerial state's perfect storm
Yeah.
because it justified the managers, and I'm using that word very broadly. I don't mean managers in the sense like a bank manager. I mean the managers of society.
Hmm.
The managers could justifiably tell us all exactly what to do and when. Here's when you're going to leave to
Wow.
stay in your house. Here's when you're going to close your business. Here's when you're going to mask your kids. Here's when you can't stay in the park. I mean, it's a triumph. I mean,
Yeah.
it didn't work. It didn't work. And
Right.
I want to keep this in mind. Management, as directed by government, does not mean that the government's going to give you a good outcome. That's
Mhm.
totally beside the point. The point is not the outcome. The point is the control.
Exactly.
And so if you look at both the wokeism and the COVID, the woke continues to be, and COVID was, a perfect situation for the state to tell us all what to do.
I think you're absolutely right. Yeah, COVID-19, the state on steroids, and
Right.
political control. So I do want to take our conversation for a second, flip it on its head,
Mhm.
and say, are we being too polite? In the sense that, Bruce, yeah, the law's out of control. It's about micromanaging people. But quite frankly, it's all driven by these politicians that are notorious for wanting to stay in what again? Oh, yeah, power.
Hmm.
And they just simply want to use our money. So they will do anything to say anything with your money to get your vote. And so, political parties are not about public policy, really, when you scratch beneath the surface. They say they are. But once they get into power, it's just the same old circus where people want to use your money. So they just keep expanding the state and promising more and more.
Right.
And so am I being too cynical, Bruce?
No, you're not. No, you're not. So that's a funny thing, right? Because so when we talk about markets, those of us who champion markets accept as sort of a premise that when you're transacting in a market, you pursue your own self-interest. And that's good. That's fine, because that self-interest allows the market to produce the best outcomes. But then we forget that people pursue their self-interest when they're in government instead.
Exactly.
And so both the politicians and the bureaucrats who are embedded in the state, the first thing that they do, and this is just because they're human, not because they're evil, it's just because they're human, they pursue their own self-interest. So if you give them power to tell the rest of us what to do, they're going to use it.
Yeah, exactly.
And we've come to the point now where we used to have these ideas, and they were never pure, never absolute. There was never a sort of a golden moment where everything worked exactly the way it was supposed to. But we've had these ideas in the past that have restrained governments, both politicians and bureaucrats and courts even. And we sometimes call that idea the rule of law. That idea is fading away because the people who are in charge of things actually don't really believe in that idea anymore. So, it's still hanging around. People will still say it applies. People will still say it's important, but really it's not.
Okay. So you mentioned the word fade. So, gosh, this could go in so many areas that are fascinating. But when you think of the awareness and the appreciation for the incredible tradition and inheritance of the rule of law and all that goes with it, and that vision of society, the good society, I would say not the state society.
Right.
We've got a big task to get the word out there, the level of awareness that people would wake up so they can see what's going on before they lose that sight. Is that right?
It is right. But part of the challenge here is that people, elites speak in code often.
Yeah,
and they speak in terms that are frankly designed not to be completely understood.
They lie.
Well, they lie, but they do lie on occasion, but also they speak in a way that reflects their own predilections. And they're not always intending to lie. So for example, let's just clarify this rule of law idea for a moment, because even that, like so many other terms, the meaning of the term the rule of law is changing, because nobody in their right mind is going to say, I don't believe in the rule of law.
Right.
They will all say that they do. But people have this, some people have this idea that the rule of law means that we have to have laws. And that if we have laws, then we're cool because that's the requirement. And that's not what the rule of law, at least for my money, that's not what the rule of law means at all. We have lots of laws, lots and lots and lots of laws about everything. And we have even more than that. We have laws. We have statutes, which are laws. We have regulations, which are laws. We have other kinds of laws that are less laws and more policies, guidelines, directives, and so on. And then we have sort of ad hocery on the part of lots of government agencies who are making stuff up as they go along.
Ad hocery.
Ad hocery. Sort of case by case by case by case.
Indeed.
In a situation where the decision they made about one person on Tuesday is not the way they have to go in the same kind of situation for another person on Wednesday. They're not bound by their own decisions. And so the rule of law describes a system in which the people with power in our governments, both legislatures and bureaucrats in the executive and even our courts, those people are restrained in the kind of decisions they can make. And that kind of rule of law is now very unpopular with the people who are exercising these powers.
I think you're right on. And so it behooves Canadians to wake up and to be aware of these dynamics, that they're not going to give up their power. They want to have more of it at your expense. They want you to pay for it and for you to pay the consequence ultimately. And they think they know what's best for you. It's really quite crazy. So,
well, you see, but that is absolutely true. This is one of the profound beliefs of an awful lot of people who are involved in the managerial enterprise of government. A lot of people, and it's not just government people, a lot of academics believe this too, for example. A lot of people actually sincerely believe that the people need to be guided.
And why do they think that? Because they're so smart and we're so stupid? What's going on here?
Essentially, they're educated, they're learned, they're intelligent. They've thought this through.
Wow.
They can see all the foolish mistakes that people are making, in their opinion.
Yeah.
And in order to achieve the common good, they sincerely believe that we must all be herded into a particular place.
Yeah. What an utterly absurd notion, isn't it? And so disrespectful for people's agency as human beings. So patronizing, I would say.
Oh, indeed. Oh, indeed. Yeah.
So
but they are sincere about it, though. They really do believe it.
Wow. So I am speaking with Professor Bruce Pardy, law professor at Queen's University and executive director of Law Probe and a friend of Frontier.
Rights Probe. Close enough.
Rights Probe. Pardon me. I was close, though.
Close,
Anyways,
yes.
Sorry. My apologies.
That's
But
right. No problem at all.
please join our conversation with your questions. And one of the questions I do have is freedom of speech compatible with a huge state that controls everything? Yes or no, Bruce?
Well, it's increasingly looking like the answer is no.
No.
Right. I mean, this is the implication. So our freedom of speech is being restrained both in a noticeable way. So if you look at various statutes now and plans of the government, you can see rules that are being brought in or have existed already that impose limitations on speech. But this is only half the story, because a lot of limitations on freedom of speech are imposed in other ways that are not quite so transparent. So just for one example, our professional regulatory bodies now,
indeed, yes,
for lawyers and doctors and nurses and
Jordan Peterson,
they are taking it upon themselves, on the basis of a very general grant of power in their statutes, to require their members to sign on to ideologies that the members might not agree with, and to not say things that the regulator doesn't like. So, for example, in the case of COVID, the medical regulators have been after doctors who have basically said, we don't think lockdowns are appropriate. We don't think they work. We don't think
they were right. And they were
right. They were right. But this is underlining the point about management. The result is not the point. The point is the authority. And they have government authority. So I want to make this point. These independent professional regulatory bodies, they seem independent, right? The lawyers run the lawyers one, the doctors run the doctors one. So it doesn't seem like government, but it is government, because their authority comes from government, and the government could take it away whenever they want it. And so they get a monopoly that's given to them by the government, which makes them part of the executive branch of the state.
So I think that point is well taken, but let's just back up for a sec. So these special professional societies, they're privileged, and I use a loaded term, they're privileged because the state has said you can have that special authority to regulate yourselves. Is that right?
Yeah, correct.
So that means law societies?
Correct.
Medical societies?
Yes.
Teachers,
Teachers,
there's a whole raft of them.
the whole gamut. Basically, any profession in Canada has the ability to dictate the terms of how and when you will keep your license if you're any of those kinds of people.
Okay, so I have a really interesting story as well. It has to go with an associate of ours at the Frontier Center for Public Policy, Graham Lane, has been in conversation with his professional society. It's called the Canadian Association of Chartered Accountants.
Right.
And it is shocking, but the association seems to be adopting a certain set of codes of conduct, including environmental social governance, this whole clever index scheme that certain parties are promoting to use your money for woke causes.
That's correct.
To divest from all oil and gas, to do a variety of things. I thought accountants were supposed to be there to be very focused on facts and the information, the data. Is that a good example where all of a sudden you've got a society that seems to be kind of being pulled in an ideological direction?
That's a very good example. That's exactly what I mean. You'll get one of these regulators adopting an ideological position on something and then requiring their members to adopt it too. So when you think of your professional advisors, whether they're accountants or lawyers or doctors or whoever they are, as independent, that characteristic is really not obvious anymore. The profession may be independent of the government in the sense that the regulator is independent, but the regulator may not be allowing the individuals to be independent and to express themselves independently.
So you're really, this is really profound stuff, Bruce, that you're talking about, because it begs the question then, is my doctor serving me or serving some kind of weird ideology?
Well, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. And you cannot count on them serving you independently anymore because they have to of course, it varies from regulator to regulator. But it's possible that their particular regulator is requiring them to toe a particular line that may or may not be in your interests. Now, I would have thought that, for example, if you were going to your doctor, you would want that doctor to give you their own particular independent, thoughtful view of your situation. And then you might go to another one if you had access to one.
Okay, so it's a good thing. So this is an action point. As a citizen,
yes,
don't be bashful to ask your professional, hey, are you a professional or are you also buying into, what would you ask them, Bruce? Coach.
Well, so here's the problem. The definition of that term, professional, if they're going to continue to be a professional, the danger is that they're being required to sign on to some of these things.
So this is kind of sneaky stuff, isn't it? They're trying to do the sidestep.
It absolutely is. And that's what I mean when I say it's not entirely transparent. I mean, you can't go to the statute books and look this up and see what rules are being imposed because it's not done that way. In the statute, all you can find is the general grant of power to the regulator.
Okay, so without trying to sound silly, would it make any sense to go to your lawyer and say, have you gone woke?
Well, you could say that, but then it would depend upon how they decided to answer you.
Of course, yeah.
Right?
That's awful.
Right.
Excuse me. I think that in that context, though, this is really very sad because this undermines the level of trust that people have between a client and their professional.
Yes.
We should have, I guess, one of the things I've always appreciated about working with certainly the professionals I've worked with is a sense that they are serving me in the most professional way possible, and they're not being diverted into some other cause. They haven't become political, but they are serving my interests. And this is all being undermined. And I think this is a huge, dare I say, not just a professional screw up, if I can use that word, but also one that I think will undermine the credibility of these professions. I think they'll lose the trust of the, dare I say, the Canadian public.
Yes, except that they have the advantage of monopoly, right? So because there's only one regulator in each province for each profession, and if they are successful in, herding their members into a particular ideological position, and if they're successful in sort of getting rid of anyone who doesn't really go along with this agenda, then there won't be any other professionals in that area to go to.
Exactly. Well, but at some point, I think people are waking up. I think that there's nothing like good sunlight to disinfect these, dare I say, decrepit little dark corners of our society that is happening. And I know that you've done some incredible work with law societies, and we know a bit about that. But I think that there's a real need for light to be shone on these issues, and for Canadians to debate this. It's not just for the quote societies to discuss this in their own little room. And I think if they don't do that, and if they're naive to that, I think they are into a rude awakening over time. I think that people can take their business elsewhere. And I know there's a monopoly, but we need to go to government and say that the monopoly needs to be broken. This is absurd.
I think you're right. I hope you're right that it will go that way. But the cautionary tale for me, or one of them, is going back to the big picture, is what has happened over a long period of time with the administrative state itself. I mean, it's sort of, we've been like frogs in boiling water.
Indeed.
And over decades, we have not yet, and yet being the operative word, we have not yet gotten to the point of us saying, enough, this has gone far enough. We want to ratchet back both the size of the state and the degree to which it interferes in our lives. It has only gone, basically, I mean, it's the pendulum swings back and forth a little bit, but mostly it's gone in one direction, which is bigger and more intrusive over time. And whether or not we will get to that point where we're able to say enough because we realize it, it's just that we have not realized it yet. And at a certain point, it's going to be, it's already going to be very, very difficult.
No, I think you're right. You referenced COVID-19 as being almost like a heyday for the larger administrative state and really the use of law. I'm wondering as well whether we could talk a little bit about the world of lawfare.
Right.
And these are my words, but the perverse use of law to basically go after one's political, ideological opponents, and to weaponize the law instead of using the law as a quote guardrail, but to use it as a sledgehammer to basically dominate others who may not agree with you politically. I think of many examples of lawfare. I mean, one of the famous ones would be the kind of so-called Soviet show trials that are being used in the United States, against Donald Trump. And I mean that in no partisan way. It's just a fact that those are obviously uses of lawfare. They're not based on any evidence whatsoever. So the issue becomes this. In Canada, where are you seeing the use of lawfare, and how do we deal with that in our society, Bruce? I know that's a larger topic, but can you help us understand that?
I think the thing we have to acknowledge first is that if there are situations in which that is being done, or at least one in which we would characterize it that way, the people who are doing it might not characterize it that way. Mm-hmm. What they are doing instead, at least in their minds, is using the law as a tool to prevent wrong thinking.
Mm-hmm. Wrong thinking.
Wrong thinking, or wrong behavior, or wrong speech, or, in other words, they, and this is in their minds, they are the ones who are protecting civilization from those who have lost their way. And what they are doing is necessary and justified because they understand what is needed, and their targets do not. So, for example, let's talk about Donald Trump for a minute. So, I understand what you're saying, and I perceive it in the same way. But I have talked to people who have said essentially this. They have said, Donald Trump is a threat to democracy itself.
Right.
And therefore, when I or others take these steps to try and prevent him from getting into power again, we are saving our country from the dark place that he would take it to.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, I don't agree with that characterization at all,
Mm-hmm.
but they don't think they are being evil. They think they're the good ones and that they are bringing these tools to bear against those who would do the country wrong.
Yeah, and I suppose that's true, that it's consistent with their view of themselves as the good and the great, and that the ends justify the means as they are building utopia, right? Yes, of course.
Absolutely.
So, yeah. So this
And
is
one reason why. It's one reason why when people characterize this as lawfare, weaponization of the law, they are, so dismissive of even the thought that this might be what it constitutes.
exactly. So in the Canadian context, we have yet to see one shred of evidence, medical health evidence, to be precise, to my knowledge, that there was any justification for that mandate imposed on a group of people who drive trucks all day in their cab. And there's no evidence to suggest that was any justified, other than it seems to be a political initiative, a so-called wedge issue to somehow finger this group of people that just a year before were celebrated as heroes as they delivered things 24/7 that allowed the country to continue to survive.
Yes.
Is that an example of the use of lawfare?
Well, I would characterize it as that. It is the use of rules in conjunction with a political strategy to achieve a political result.
Mm-hmm.
But again, I think it's useful to understand how other people that we might not agree with, would think about these issues.
Indeed.
I've talked to an awful lot of people who were not, government insiders and not even particularly sympathetic to the power, the government in power, especially the federal one, who still have some inclination to say, well, it was a pandemic and it was rushed and it was an emergency and it was a threat to people. And therefore, I'm willing to give them the benefit of the doubt until I see data to the contrary that's conclusive. It might have been appropriate for them to create rules that were designed at least to be in the common interest.
Mm-hmm.
And these people are very difficult to persuade that there was nothing in it.
But surely one of the hallmarks of good public policy, and dare I say good lawmaking, is the transparent tabling of information and data to support your decision. Otherwise,
well,
in light of everything that's happened, it's just all political nonsense, isn't it?
Well, yes, that's true, except that we have this. Our system of government forever is an exaggeration, but for a long, long time, has been based upon the idea of legislative supremacy, meaning an elected legislature can pass any rules that it wants. And its justification is the fact that it's elected. In other words, if you pass this bill, you're not obliged to show the population your reasoning for the bill. I mean, you might want to because it's politically sensible to do that, but you're not required to. So if the legislature passes a statute, assuming that the courts don't declare it to be unconstitutional, which is the one exception, the legislature can do anything it wants.
Wow, this sounds like Louis XIV.
We see that work. That works for as long as you have wise and prudent and restrained legislators.
Indeed. Well, it's interesting.
But when you don't, now you're in trouble.
Yes, indeed. And as we speak now, the federal government is ramming through its so-called just transition bill, which will transform the economy and every Canadian's life, the cost of living, as they basically phase out oil and gas. And really change affordable energy, and that will cascade through every area, and certainly in our analysis, every area of the economy, because the oil and gas industry isn't just based on your vehicle. It also relates to the cost of manufacturing, every industry called forestry, mining, service sectors. I mean, everything.
Yes.
So it's
Yes.
kind of a
Yes.
really, really, in our opinion, a bad public policy.
Oh, it's terrible. It's
terrible.
terrible idea.
And
It
meanwhile,
makes,
they're allowing for just a meager set of a couple hours of debate. So
well,
the
yeah, but
wow.
this sort of underlines the problem, right? So you and I and many other people agree that this is a terrible idea without substance to it in terms of, the data upon which it pretends to be based. That it's insane. But
Okay,
but the problem is that we have set up our government so that this is possible, even
exactly.
when things don't make sense. The politicians have power and the bureaucracy has power, and they are not required to justify their decisions on the basis of data.
Okay, so this is, I think you're putting your finger onto something very important. And I do have a question from the audience, and it basically is further to the whole professional association question. It says,
Yes.
do our individual rights come from the government just as professional licensing?
Do our individual rights come? Say that again for me.
Do our individual rights come from the government
Yes.
just as professional licensing?
Just as professional licensing. I'm thinking that the meaning of the question is what is the origins of our rights?
I think that's all
Yes.
tied in with that. Yeah.
Okay. So there is this philosophy, if you like, that we have natural rights, that we are born with natural rights, and it's not the government's role to give us our rights that we already have.
And I would vote for that, Bruce.
Right, I understand, and philosophically, I'm inclined that way as well. I think there are some rights that you inherently have just by being alive.
Mm-hmm.
Excuse me. But this is where we need to draw a clear distinction between philosophy and law, because if we don't, we're going to get all mixed up.
Mm-hmm.
So I agree with that philosophically, but the law is what the courts say it is. I mean, that's the ugly truth with respect to any lawyer who's dealing with actual legal cases. You can't go into court and say, well, I have natural rights and they're not mentioned in the Constitution and you haven't recognized them before. But believe me, I have natural rights and the government doesn't have to give them to me. I can just have them enforced. And the court's going to say, well, show me the precedent, or show me the statute, or show me the section of the charter. And you have to say, well, there isn't one. And the court's going to say, well, I don't know what you're talking about then.
Right.
Right. So if you can enforce it in a courtroom, then it is part of the law. And if you can't, then it's not. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't have these inherent rights that the government should protect us, should protect. But in the law, it isn't always necessarily so.
Yeah. So you're being practical in the sense that ultimately the law is how it's practiced, but it doesn't mean that we shouldn't be advocating for that vision.
No, not at all.
And in fact, that's in keeping. I mean, this is the quandary that we're in, is that that's been the tradition of our law, but it's been the ground has shifted.
But see, this is part of the irony here. So, we got this Charter of Rights in 1982, right? And many people have observed, and I think quite rightly, that in some respects we seemed to have more rights before the Charter than we do have now. And yet, constitutionally, we did not. Because up until the Charter, I mean, there were still constitutional restrictions of some kinds, but they were much less individual than the Charter provides. And the fact of the matter was that in many situations, legislatures could simply pass a bill that eviscerated your rights in the common law. And sometimes they did. And so I mean, yeah, there was a tradition, but the tradition was not enforceable in a courtroom before 1982 either.
Right.
So a lot of this is to some extent, this is based upon a myth that we had things in a certain way in the past and now we don't, and that's not quite true.
Okay, that makes sense. So we're kind of in the home stretch here, Bruce, but I did want to again encourage your audience to get in your last question for Professor Pardy. And I do have another one here, but I did want to just wrap up with a kind of a question, and it relates to what do we do? What do we do here in terms of action? What's our counsel? And one of the things I know that I've shared with you is an interesting book called Re-Enlightening Canada. It's been published by Frontier with Dr. Brian Schwartz, a law professor at the University of Manitoba. And basically, Dr. Schwartz makes a number of interesting suggestions in terms of how we can perhaps get the law better on track. I mean, if we look at so many elements of our universities are kind of off the rails in terms of being places of intellectual diversity. I mean, not entirely, but they're really quite challenged.
Yeah.
And one of his ideas is to, for instance, amending the Human Rights Code to include freedom of expression. Imagine that. We've got all these fancy laws all over, including the 1982 Charter of Rights and Freedoms, but we seem to not be able to implement freedom of expression, at least not to the degree by which we perhaps should, or at least I would argue. Is Dr. Schwartz onto something here?
Yes and no. So I agree with him that these kinds of rights ought to be protected by human rights codes. And I agree that it would be a good idea to insert them because right now the human rights codes don't operate this way at all. And there are some that literally, for example, the one in BC literally says that you cannot make public statements that discriminate on the basis of some protected ground.
Yes.
So largely these human rights codes are acting to suppress speech. Yes, I take that point and I agree with it. But there is something more insidious even about how human rights codes work, which is this. It appears that they are worded such that they give everybody the right to be free from discrimination, both from government, but also in the private sector. But the way increasingly they are being interpreted, and there are some loopholes built in to them, that means that this right of not being discriminated against is being applied selectively in favor of some groups and not in favor of other groups. So for example, let's say you are a member of a hiring committee at a business, a corporation of some kind, and you are heard to say the following thing. You've got a stack of applications for the next job, and you say, "Well, let's hire her because she's a woman." Okay, well, that's fine. You're showing that you are awake and woke and interested in social justice, and you want to increase the number of women in your workplace. You're going to be praised for that. But let's just turn it around. Let's say you are overheard saying exactly the same thing, but only change it a little bit. Let's not hire her because she's a woman. Okay, now you're in hot water.
Wow.
Right? So you can express a preference in favor of certain groups safely, but not against them safely. Or let's turn it around.
So it's only, you're saying it's only one way, Bruce?
It only goes one way in many, many circumstances. Let's try the other way around. Let's say you have a male applicant. Okay. Here's one thing you can say safely. You can say, probably. I don't want to predict the result in every single situation, but the trend is, if you are heard to say in the meeting, well, he's a man, so let's not hire him. As opposed to the reverse, which is, oh, he's a man, let's hire him because he's a man. Okay. Now you know you're going to get in trouble. Right? So the tendency is now that these rules are applied in a particular direction.
Gosh.
And the Ontario Human Rights Commission has even said out loud in a decision that white people cannot claim discrimination under the Human Rights Code.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
The Human Rights Commission of Ontario has said out loud in a decision that white people cannot claim discrimination
Wow.
under the code.
That's almost bizarre.
Well, yes, it's bizarre if you look at the wording, but it's not bizarre if you look at the trends.
Okay, but in that context, I thought that, when I was a kid, I always memorized Martin Luther King Jr.'s speeches. And
Yes.
We know the speech well, that we judge people not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character.
Yes.
And dare I say their merit.
Right. But when people say that today, they're called racists. Because that's what they mean by racists now. Racism today has been turned on its head to mean something else. What they mean today is that you are not giving preference to the right races.
Wow, what a horrible.
If you insist of applying the same rules and standards to everybody, then you are a racist.
Well, I beg to differ, Professor Pardy. I would advocate for a society that is based on our character, not our color of our skin. Period.
I wholly agree with you, but there are forces out there that do not.
So, in this context, though, I think you've hit a very important chord, and that is, where do we go from here in terms of hope? And I think it goes back to the citizen. We have seen the enemy, it's us, but also the solution is us as citizens to speak up. I was an elected official, and I got calls on thousands of people, and it meant a great deal to be responding to those inquiries of concern. And I think if we leave a vacuum, we have given a de facto stamp of approval on this nonsense.
100%. 100%. We have to have people in numbers decide that they are tired of being managed by people who think they know better than them. But until that happens, it's going to carry on.
Okay, so citizens do have a lot of power. I think that is true, but we have to mobilize people to pick up the phone once a month and call that representative on a thoughtful issue. I don't mean this in a pestering way or a thoughtless way, but in a respectful way.
Yep.
And to speak up. The thing that I found fascinating about COVID-19 is that I was really quite astounded by how compliant Canadians were. And I know that many Canadians are very nice people. If we step on each other's toes in the elevator, we're all saying sorry before we even go down to the floor. But what we have is a situation where it begs the question, how do we speak up for ourselves and not assume that the government always has our interests in mind? And I think what happened during COVID-19, and maybe I'm being a little bit too cynical, but this revelation crossed my mind. I was the head of my church for a while. And would you believe our modest-sized church was getting $125,000 every year from the federal government.
Wow.
And I think this is the story across the country, is everybody got a little bit of money. I personally didn't, but a lot of people got paid off. Yes. And I use that phrase deliberately and respectfully. Even seniors who have a regular, slot of income got an enhancement. Yes. So by golly, there's a reason why we have such a monster-sized debt and deficit, is that they just opened up the spigots and basically paid everybody off. And there's a lot of people who are just happy to be compliant and almost take a, quote, sabbatical.
But see, this is the, if I can use the word, I don't like the word, but I'm going to say this is the structural problem with the administrative state the way it is. The more people, the higher the proportion of people who become dependent, reliant upon the administrative state, the fewer people who are going to be able to say, we don't want this anymore. And once you get past a certain threshold, that is the likelihood of it happening becomes quite small.
Wow. By the way, I'm getting a lot of comments. One was, I'm sorry I joined the program too late, but it will be recorded, so be sure to stay tuned. And another comment is, it is true. Our political system is absolutely flawed and certainly not democratic. And I think that's kind of what you're saying, is it not, Professor Pardy?
Well, I'm not saying it entirely. I mean, we still have elections, but the decision about what's going to happen tomorrow is less and less a decision that's made in the legislature and more a decision that's made in the back rooms.
Indeed.
Right.
So one of the things is, just to reiterate, the importance of the citizen's role. And there are lots of areas of hope, I would argue, across the Canada. I think the example of the truckers was really quite an inspiration, not only for people coast to coast in Canada, but certainly around the world, as they really lit up the question, are these mandates necessary and appropriate given the kind of very low mortality rates and so forth. So that's one area. The other one is, I think, in good public policy. And I know, Bruce, we've talked about this before, but at Frontier, we celebrate the work of a labor finance minister, no less. And that was from New Zealand years ago when New Zealand was going sideways. There was the great Sir Roger Douglas. And by the way, you can find my interview with him just recently from a number of months ago. But the whole point was Sir Roger Douglas was getting rid of privilege, the special interests who drive a lot of our so-called public policy in our country.
Yes.
And what I liked about Sir Roger was, well, let's just take education, for example. We could sidestep all this nonsense about, educational woke bureaucracies by giving people, what are they called? School vouchers. Give the money to the parents and they choose where to send the child. And this is long overdue, I think, in our country, to have those kinds of fulsome debates around really giving the money or letting people keep their money, quite frankly, so they can make their choices. And so I think that's part of the answer here, isn't it, to this messy business of how the law is evolving, Professor Pardy?
The more choice that people have over their own destinies, the better off we are.
So you would vote for that?
Yeah. And let's get back to the truckers for a moment. I mean, the truckers were such an important moment for this country, I think, in part because it was one of the first times I can think of where ordinary people basically said, enough, we don't trust you anymore to make our decisions for us. We don't give our consent to this. We don't accept your authority to decide this for us. And
exactly.
And that was the real threat to the government. I don't mean there was an actual physical threat. I mean, they weren't going to storm the parliament or anything, but they were expressing an opinion that actually undermined, or had the potential to undermine, if it spread, the legitimacy of the way things are done.
Well said.
And that's why it's such a good start. It's a start of something, and I hope we can build on it.
Well, I really like your vision and the way you think, Professor Pardy, and I'm so grateful for your leadership and your work, and that you could join us for this conversation. And we're going to keep this conversation going with Professor Pardy and so many others. So be sure to join us every week for these live discussions on both X and also on YouTube. And we welcome your comments and your feedback. And we're so delighted that so many of you could not only contribute your questions, but also your comments. So again, thank you, Professor Bruce Pardy, and be sure to join us next week. And I believe we're going to have a discussion about Christmas, no less, with Professor Jerry Bowler, who has written about the 2000 story of history, its true meaning, of course, but also how Christmas has been used by so many for their own agendas. Imagine that. But I think you'll find that a fascinating discussion. So I want to thank you so much for joining us, and we'll look forward to that discussion next week. Thank you.